The Spanish Parliament has decided to extend the country's lockdown. Spain is one of the worst hit countries in the world, with more than 21,000 deaths. It's been under severe restrictions for more than 5 weeks. Guy Hedgecoe is in Madrid.
This is the third time that Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez has requested a 2-week extension of the lockdown. This will take us through to the middle of May. It was quite an overwhelming win in terms of the parliamentary numbers, 269 votes in favour, 60 against. Now that sounds very convincing. I suppose in terms of the arithmetic it is, but it was a very divisive session in Parliament today, and Pedro Sánchez and his government faced a lot of criticism from opposition groups, particularly on the political right, who are very critical of the way that he has handled the coronavirus crisis so far, saying he's been unprepared, he hasn't communicated well, the lockdown has been handled poorly. He defended his government's handling of the crisis throughout and said that he's simply done the best that he can in very difficult circumstances.
Well, now let's turn to Italy, where the number of patients being treated for COVID-19 has fallen for a third successive day. The daily number of deaths recorded has fallen by almost 100 to 437. This comes as the country's official death toll topped 25,000. Well, if you have a look at these pictures, this is rotting crops. Millions of Italians, of course, remaining under lockdown. There are concerns about the plight of farmers in the southern regions. Over 350,000 foreign nationals work in the agricultural sector in Italy. Many of these are Romanian, Polish, Bulgarian or Ukrainian who left Italy at the start of this epidemic. Now, Italy's National Agricultural Organisation says that 40% of all Italian produce could be simply left to rot in the fields if 200,000 day labourers aren't found soon. Here's Laura Gozzi.
For farmers, for instance, it's ruled that crop owners will be able to enlist the help of family members or relatives to work in the fields without having to officially employ them. But to be honest, that will only go such a short way in filling the gap that's been left by the 300,000 seasonal workers that typically come to Italy from Romania and Bulgaria, and who this year have either gone back home at the beginning of the pandemic before borders closed, or who will be unable to come to Italy for the next harvest season. And in any case, even if borders were to reopen across Europe tomorrow and people wanted to flock to Italy to work the crops, farmers have warned that the agriculture industry would have to go through significant changes to ensure that it complies with government regulations that have to do with health and safety. For instance, the seasonal workers very often are put up to sleep in caravans or dorms where social distancing is essentially impossible. And obviously, in the current climate, in a country that's been absolutely ravaged by the pandemic, this is just not a viable option.
Well, thanks to Laura Gozzi there. Now to Germany's handling of the coronavirus pandemic. With its early large-scale testing, effective lockdown and low death rate, well, it was the focus of international attention. Now the world is watching again, this time as its restrictions are gradually lifted. Jenny Hill reports from Berlin.
Slowly, cautiously, Germany's feeling its way back to life. Schools reopening for exams. Small shops back in business. At the same time, more testing and a focus on contact tracing. Every time someone tests positive, public health officials must track down anyone they could have infected.
Of course, it's not always possible to find everyone. We depend on the support and the memory of the infected person. They have to work with us, try to remember who they've had contact with.
It's why the army is helping to test a more high-tech solution. It's hoped a phone app could identify potential chains of infection. But there are concerns about privacy, and the technology is considered at least a month from being ready. In the meantime, Germany's studying its own population, looking for antibodies. The aim to establish the true rate of infection, but also to learn more about how immunity might develop.
You also need to have a better idea clinically. If antibodies are detected, how does that really reflect in terms of protection? And if it reflects in terms of protection, how long will that protection last? And obviously, since we are very early in this stage of the pandemic, we don't know that for sure yet. But this data will be coming in.
Meanwhile, Oktoberfest's annual revelry has been cancelled. Public gatherings are still banned, pubs and restaurants still closed. Germany may have got its outbreak under control, but it's far too soon, warn scientists, to celebrate. Jenny Hill, BBC News, Berlin.
Romania has been issuing hefty fines for those caught breaking lockdown rules there. Anyone found outside without the proper documents can be fined between $400 and $4,000. Alison Mutler is a journalist in Bucharest.
In the past month, more than 200,000 Romanians have been fined for breaking lockdown rules. Now, Romanians, when they go out for something like buying food or taking exercise or for some urgent medical attention, they need to fill out a form explaining why they've gone out. It's rather like they do in Italy and in Spain. And they need to present an ID card if they're stopped by the police. Now, if they break those rules, they are fined, and the fines range anywhere between 2,000 lei and 20,000 lei. Now, in Romania, the average monthly salary is 3,000 lei, so that's quite a hefty sum. And it's just not just ordinary Romanians who are breaking these rules, but we had this weekend a district mayor in Bucharest, the capital. He went cycling in a park. Now, he said parks are closed, and he said he was just inspecting the park, but he still got fined and he agreed to pay the fine.
Hefty fines in Romania. The impact of this coronavirus emergency is showing up the fault lines of economic and also social inequality across the world, especially in Latin America. Particularly vulnerable to the pandemic are those in the informal economy who work odd jobs without formal contracts and often without any labour protection. So if we take Colombia as an example, reports like this one, this is from the New York Times, it tells us that since the country shut down, many have gone without food and have been forced onto the streets. Venezuelans who've escaped their own country's economic collapse are particularly vulnerable. Some workers have rebelled. These are images taken at a market in Lima, which is the capital of Peru. More than 21,000 workers have been detained in Peru for not complying with orders to stay at home there. In Mexico, informal workers generate nearly a quarter of Mexico's economic output. Many of them are street vendors whose businesses have simply ground to a halt. Well, we've already seen the impact that that's been having. We've spotted these pictures on Facebook of a popular tourist town on Mexico's east coast. Restaurants, beaches, which are usually thronging with people, are absolutely empty. Coronavirus restrictions have all but shut down these local economies, and people here are appealing for help. Well, the BBC's Mexico and Central America correspondent Will Grant joins us live. Will, I know you're in the UK at the moment, but you're of course monitoring your patch very closely. When it comes to those people who are in that informal economy, the people doing odd jobs, they're already in a difficult position. What happens to them when they work in fragile economies like in Latin America?
Yeah, in the Mexico example, they really are the lifeblood of the economy in many ways. You know, the number of families being sustained by people in the informal economy is, in the many millions. And as you just saw there from the empty beaches, that's vendors of food, drink, of trinkets, whatever it might be. That just keeps these towns alive and, as I say, sustains so many families. They're stuck. I've been speaking to people, on these and other issues that are facing Mexico. And it's a very, very difficult picture. So many people are faced with that impossible dilemma. Do you take a risk of going outside and therefore exposing yourself and your family to COVID-19 and possible infection, or do you remain indoors and in many cases can't eat because you simply haven't earned the money you need that day or that week? So it is extremely difficult and the sort of dilemma, as I say, facing a large swathe of Mexico.
And with countries that are so reliant on tourism, for example, how are the authorities, how are the police forces there trying to ensure that the beaches do remain empty?
Well, that order has come from quite close to the start of the pandemic, really, that beaches had to shut down. And the authorities are enforcing it. That I'm thinking of states like Baja California Sur, Baja California, Oaxaca. These places are being heavily affected by the fact that tourism internally in Mexico, which is very popular to those parts of the country, simply isn't taking place at the moment, and of course the police are clamping down too. So it's an extremely difficult picture, and if you combine that with what's going on in Mexico City, big urban hub, steps being taken to sort of clamp down on transport, for example, again key to the way people run their lives, that they use their cars not only to get to work but as a source of work itself. So it is an extremely complex picture, and at the same time the government is doing what it can for the numbers that are shooting up all the time. They've entered what they call the third phase, the most dangerous phase of infection in Mexico at the moment.
Well, thanks so much for keeping across that. Our Mexico and Central America correspondent, Will Grant, thank you so much.